In January 1536, Menno entirely walks away from his secure priesthood to cast his lot with these hunted, scattered Anabaptists. How did a religious group famous for strict pacifism inspire a violent, apocalyptic insurrection? It's a pretty jarring paradox, isn't it? Just imagine a group of believers whose entire core theological tenet, based on a very literal reading of the Sermon on the Mount, is nonresistance. We're talking about people who point-blank refuse to bear arms, refuse to swear oaths, and even refuse to participate in civil government. And yet, somehow, in the 1530s, a radical splinter group of these exact same people seized an entire city by force, they stockpiled weapons, and fought a bloody war against imperial armies. So how exactly does a movement leap from turn the other cheek all the way to take the city by the sword? To really grasp the sheer shock of this, we need to look at Menno Simons. He was a former Catholic priest who eventually became one of the foundational leaders of the peaceful Anabaptists. In fact, the Mennonites are actually named after him. Now, Menno Simons was just utterly horrified by this sudden violence. He wrote that his soul was grieved beyond endurance by the ungodly doctrine of what was happening in the city of Münster. For Menno, the sword had absolutely zero place in the kingdom of God.
Chapter 1. The Radical Departure. So clearly, not everyone shared Menno's strict pacifism. To figure out this anomaly, we have to look at the ideological fractures that were happening within the movement right from the get-go.
In places like Nikolsburg, there was a literal physical division. On one side, you had the Stabler, the staff bearers. These were the traditionalists who maintained absolute pacifism, basically refusing to carry anything more dangerous than a simple walking stick. But on the other side were the Schwertler, the sword bearers. This radical faction started to believe that the sword actually could, and maybe even should, be used to bring about the New Jerusalem. You have to remember, they were deeply frustrated. They were dealing with crushing social injustices, terrible oppression of the peasant class, and just heavy, heavy persecution from state authority. Chapter 2. A New Jerusalem by Force. That sword-bearing ideology, it was basically dry tinder. All it needed was a spark. And that spark finally came in the form of end times panic. Right in the early 1530s, this preacher named Melchior Hoffman was traveling through the Low Countries, and he was spreading these intense, apocalyptic visions about the millennium. He was preaching that the return of Christ was imminent, happening right now, and this end times theology fostered some incredible social unrest. Now, Hoffman himself didn't actually wield a sword. He actually ended up locked away in a prison in Strasbourg, but his radical followers took his visions to the absolute extreme. Supported by the theological writings of a guy named Bernard Rothman, men like Jan Matthijs and John of Leiden basically decided, you know what? We can't just sit around and wait for the New Jerusalem to descend from heaven. We need to build it ourselves, by force, right here in the German city of Münster. And if we trace the timeline, it shows a terrifyingly rapid and chaotic escalation. In 1530, Hoffman is out there preaching. Fast forward to 1534, and radical Anabaptists actually seize control of Münster. They overthrow the government to build this absolute Christian commonwealth. And the fire just kept spreading. Emissaries like Jan van Galen were sent out to spark uprisings in other areas, which led directly to a violent takeover of the Oldeklooster monastery in April 1535 by about 300 Frisian Anabaptists. Chapter 3. The Siege and the Fall. Now, state authorities, both Catholic and Protestant alike, were absolutely terrified by this armed peasant uprising, clothed in all this religious fervor. And their response? It was overwhelming, crushing military force. 300. I want you to keep this tragic number in your mind. This is the number of Anabaptists killed when the imperial governor used heavy artillery to literally storm the Oldeklooster monastery. See, the radicals had seized that monastery, actually hoping to conquer the entire province of Friesland. But instead, they were met with a brutal, relentless siege. After the monastery was bombarded and stormed, the folks who weren't killed outright in the battle were captured, given really short trials, and executed by either beheading or drowning. And this brings us back to Menno Simons. The very man who preached absolute peace lost his own brother, Peter, who was among those killed in that violent Oldeklooster takeover. It's highly probable that witnessing this senseless slaughter firsthand and seeing his own family swept up in this fanatical violence is what permanently solidified Menno's absolute, unwavering rejection of the sword. Meanwhile, back in Münster, the utopian dream had turned into a complete nightmare. In 1535, the city was eventually recaptured by state authorities. The radical leaders were executed in just horrific ways. Their bodies hung in cages from the church tower as a dark warning to everyone else. The insurrection was brutally, definitively suppressed. The New Jerusalem had officially fallen. Chapter 4. Distancing from the fanatics. The physical battle was over, but the ideological war for the soul and, honestly, the very survival of the Anabaptist movement was just beginning. The surviving, peaceful Anabaptists now faced a huge existential crisis, and their leaders had to launch a massive damage control campaign. First off, leaders like Menno Simons vigorously renounced the Münsterites in their writings, making it crystal clear that their violent actions were entirely unscriptural. Second, they doubled down on their core identity of defenselessness, really proving they would much rather die as martyrs than ever fight back. And third, as they started documenting their history, they meticulously excluded any mention of those violent radicals. This whole effort actually culminated in a massive 1660 book called The Martyr's Mirror, put together by Philemon von Braght. This wasn't just a history book, it was a critical survival mechanism and a major public relations tool. Von Bracht explicitly excluded any mention of the Münsterites. He needed to prove to the world and to future generations of Mennonites that true Anabaptists were earnest, scripturally grounded, and completely defenseless, non-resistant martyrs. It became a cornerstone of their identity, warning future generations against worldly entanglement and violence. Chapter 5. The Legacy of a Slur. But despite all these massive efforts to distance themselves from the violence, the ghost of Münster would end up haunting the peaceful Anabaptists for centuries. And here's where the history becomes a real warning for us today. The authorities completely weaponized this anomaly. For decades after the rebellion, both Catholic and Protestant authorities used the label Münsterite as this deadly slur. If you practice adult baptism, boom, you were labeled a Münsterite. You were a seditious rebel, a total threat to civil order. By equating the entire movement with that one single violent faction, authorities justified the horrific, systematic persecution, torture, and execution of thousands of completely peaceful, non-resistant believers. It took a really long time for the truth of their peaceful nature to be legally recognized. But eventually, we see things like this 1660 petition from the burgomesters of Rotterdam. It explicitly states that the Mennonites have cheerfully and promptly paid their taxes, never sought to excite sedition, and were just peaceful citizens. It was a formal, state-level acknowledgement that, hey, these peaceful Anabaptists were not the violent Münsterites of the past. They had finally managed to prove their true character. So think about this paradox for a second. On the surface, the phrases violent apocalyptic rebellion and famous pacifist movement do not go together, right? I mean, how do you get from a group of people literally trying to force the apocalypse with swords to a community known worldwide for refusing to ever bear arms? To make sense of this, we really need to dig into the movement's incredibly chaotic roots in the Low Countries. Let's look at the followers of Melchior Hoffman. He's the guy who introduced Anabaptist ideas to the region, and his followers, often called Melchiorites, were fueled by massive social unrest and some pretty wild apocalyptic visions. They literally believed it was their religious duty to use the sword to usher in the New Jerusalem. But somehow, this gives way to the staff-bearing pacifists who absolutely refused to fight. So how exactly did that dramatic flip happen? Well, let's break down the name first. Anabaptist literally translates to one who baptizes again. Now, in the 16th century, infant baptism wasn't just some religious ritual. It was a core pillar of civic identity and state control. By rejecting that and insisting that only adults could freely confess their faith and be baptized, Anabaptists were essentially committing treason against the state church. And the pushback was brutal. Take 1531, for example, when a man named Sicca Fricks Snyder was beheaded in Leeuwarden simply for being rebaptized. It was incredibly dangerous to challenge the religious status quo back then. And things escalated fast. In 1530, Hoffman gets a real foothold, baptizing about 300 people in Emden. But as the persecution ramps up, like that beheading we just talked about, the radical wing of the movement grows desperate. This all culminates in 1535 with the Münster Rebellion, where radical Anabaptists violently took over an entire city. Now, right around this exact same time, a localized version of this violence flares up right in the backyard of a local Catholic priest named Menno Simons. And that is the event that changes everything. We're talking about the Oldeklooster tragedy. In April 1535, around 300 radical Anabaptists seized a monastery in Friesland. The local authorities hit back with overwhelming force, bombarding the place with heavy artillery. Hundreds of Anabaptists died, either in the fight or executed right after. And one of the casualties, a man named Peter, who happened to be Menno Simons' own brother.
Now, Menno was serving as a priest nearby, and between 1526 and 1531, he'd actually already been quietly questioning Catholic dogmas like transubstantiation and infant baptism. But suddenly, he has to watch his own brother die in this violent, misguided uprising. You can imagine the crushing emotional weight of this. Piter's violent death threw Menno into a severe spiritual crisis. He wrote about praying with sighs and tears, completely agonizing over the fact that these Anabaptists were willing to die for their beliefs while he was living comfortably as a priest, preaching things he didn't even truly believe anymore, just to stay safe. It was a brutal soul-searching process, but it pushed him to make a massive leap. In January 1536, Menno entirely walks away from his secure priesthood to cast his lot with these hunted, scattered Anabaptists. From there, Menno steps up precisely when they needed a leader the most. Around 1537, he's ordained by Obbe Philips. Obbe, along with his brother Dirk, was leading a peaceful faction in the Low Countries that totally rejected the Münster violence. So Menno starts heavily consolidating the movement and initiates a massive pivot. He forcefully cuts ties with the violent radicals, and he also rejects these inspirationalist leaders, like David Joris, who thought subjective prophecies were more important than the Bible. Instead, Menno insists on absolute biblical authority. He envisions this spotless church, a community of highly disciplined, nonviolent believers completely separated from the corrupting influences of the world. By 1544, his influence was so undeniable that a brand new name starts showing up in historical records, Mennonite or Menist. And this wasn't just a casual label, it was absolutely crucial. It actively separated these peaceful, staff-bearing Dutch Anabaptists from their sword-bearing radical counterparts, in the eyes of the public and the authorities. They weren't those violent revolutionaries anymore. They were definitively Menno's followers. But we have to be clear about the cost of that leadership. 25 years. That's how long Menno lived as a hunted fugitive. Because the state churches considered him a leading heretic, there was literally a price on his head. Authorities were even offering pardons to criminals if they could bring him in. Yet, for a quarter of a century, he secretly travels all over northern Germany and the Netherlands. He ministers to his followers and writes vital theological frameworks, like the Foundation Book, keeping the movement alive through intense persecution, until he died naturally in 1561. Now, this whole era was an absolute crucible for the early Mennonites. They weren't just dodging state authorities. They were dealing with some intense internal divides. You had factions developing, like the Waterlanders and the Old Frisians, fiercely debating highly specific theological points, things like the exact nature of the incarnation or how strict excommunication needed to be to maintain their spotless church. So the reality of their daily existence was highly pressured and often pretty fractious. To make sure that immense early suffering wasn't forgotten, a monumental book was published in the 17th century called The Martyr's Mirror. Compiled by Thielemann and Javen Brocht in 1660 and later packed with these incredibly vivid engravings by Jan Eucken, it documents the trials and executions of thousands of Anabaptists. Van Brocht's goal was to unify all these splintered Mennonite groups around their shared history of suffering for believers' baptism and non-resistance. But what's really fascinating here is why he actually felt the need to remind them. And here is the ultimate irony of the Mennonite story. Within a century, the descendants of those hunted, marginalized martyrs had basically become the establishment. By the Dutch Golden Age, they had transitioned into wealthy, highly influential citizens heavily involved in commerce, art, and culture. So, Van Brocht didn't just publish The Martyr's Mirror as a history lesson. It was a stark cautionary tale. He was basically warning his comfortable, prosperous 17th century peers not to get seduced by wealth and respectability, reminding them that true faith originally cost their ancestors absolutely everything. To really grasp the depth of this pacifist theology, you just have to look at one unforgettable story from The Martyr's Mirror, the story of Dirk Willems in 1569. Dirk escapes from a prison, and he's fleeing across a frozen moat. A thief catcher is right on his heels. Dirk, who's pretty light, makes it across the ice. But his pursuer breaks through and starts drowning. Now Dirk could have just kept running, but he stops. He turns back, pulls his enemy out of the freezing water, and saves his life. And his reward for this radical act of compassion? The authorities forced that rescued man to recapture Dirk, and Dirk was burned at the stake. It's just a visceral demonstration of the absolute, profound cost of their non-resistant ideology.